Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between Jon Edwards and Chris Manning.
How do you choose what projects to pursue and what projects to say no to? So what were the factors that went into you deciding to pursue doing more film work this year?
In the past, I've set goals towards particular events. So a lot of my past goals have been set to, let's say a particular pen show or a particular art show. And I've had a lot of challenges with that in the past, because a lot of what I'm doing is experimental from my point of view. I was often running into timelines or deadlines that I just couldn't meet. Oftentimes it wasn't because I just wasn't working on a project. It was because I would run into failures of technique or failures of technology or whatever, and I would run into problems with that. One of my goals for 2018, and maybe further in the future, we'll have to see, is I'm trying to work on projects that do not have a definitive date as the end goal. I'm trying to avoid saying I have to be at this pen show or I have to be at this particular art show. Something like the video footage, working on a YouTube channel, getting projects, sort of bundled projects recorded and end up on the site. Those are things that I can work on, and if it takes an extra week, if it takes an extra month, it's not a problem because I won't be publishing it until it's a final thing. Same thing, I think, with some of the other projects that I plan on working on this year. There's an end goal in mind, but until it's a completed thing, it's not going up for sale. It's not going to be out in the world until it's a finished thing. So that's one of my goals for 2018, is to try and reduce my stress a little bit by trying to avoid hard deadlines for particular things.
So how do you keep yourself motivated to make sure you actually complete a project?
I've never been someone who really needs deadlines as a goal. One of the things we've been talking about is my paper this year for the Santa Fe Symposium. At this point, I'm a little bit late in getting that submitted. And for me, that deadline, that hard deadline, is more stressful than it is an inducement to getting it finished. My motivation for getting things done isn't really driven by a particular date. I find that having the project done properly, having it done to my satisfaction in terms of the fit and finish of the final thing, that tends to be more of a motivator to me. I'm one of those people who want to have the finished thing in my hands, and that's the motivator to me. A particular deadline doesn't necessarily motivate me very well.
Yeah, I have aspects of that in some areas of my life and then not in others. I value areas where I have an intrinsic motivation to finish something. I find projects like that far easier for me to drop into a state of flow when working on something that I'm intrinsically motivated to complete. But I find there are some things where I do respond better to an extrinsic motivator. I think due dates of libraries are an undervalued feature of libraries. 'Cause I have books that I've purchased from Amazon or where have you, and I'll crack it open, I'll read a few pages, and then it sits,
right?
And then I don't finish it. But I find anytime I check a book out from the library, it might sit for a couple days at the beginning, but at some point I am motivated to pick it up and finish reading it. And if it happens to be a book that I start and I don't particularly want to finish, or I'm not finding value in it, it's fine. I'll set it aside. But that due date from the library will push me to sit down for an hour or two the day before it's due and actually polish it off if I'm not quite done with it yet. Whereas if it's a book that I've purchased, it might sit there for 2, 3, 4, 5 years or more without me actually completing reading it.
Yeah, I can see the value in that, and that is something that I do as well. I have a bookshelf full of books that I have partly read. In some cases, the books are not ones that I am going to read from cover to cover anyways. They're reference books, or they're books where I'm looking for a particular part of the book. I'm really only interested in a few chapters of something for reference.
Mhm.
So not all of what I have there is really appropriate from that point of view, but
Mhm.
certainly I agree with you. For some things like that, there's definitely a motivating factor in having a deadline to it, and certainly with some of my to-do list items, I need to have a to-do list. I need to have a date on something. I need to have a timeline on something. Otherwise, I just don't get around to it. But I find that tends to be for smaller things, for things that really it's more of a reminder than an actual project. I find with larger projects themselves, I need a little bit of flexibility when it comes to finishing things. I guess one of my problems is when I run into an issue with a particular build, I need to be able to stop and work on something else. I find that my brain does its best troubleshooting when it isn't thinking about a problem. So let's say I'm working on a casting project and I'm having some casting issues. That's the kind of thing where if I just sit down and make a model, cast it, have a problem with it, make a new model, cast it, maybe have the same problem or a slightly different problem with it, and just keep iterating on that, I can spin my wheels for 4 or 5 days, maybe even 2 weeks, just trying to sit there and continually retry the things that I'm doing. That can be time consuming and resource consuming as well. There's a cost associated with doing a lot of what I'm doing. Sometimes it's materials cost, sometimes it's resources like electricity or just time. Whereas if I have a problem, stop, work on something else, work on a completely different project or a completely different thing, that problem is still working in the back of my brain. I will have ideas 2 or 3 days later, or maybe even a week later, that I won't have if it's constantly something that I'm hammering away at. And this is where my deadline problem comes in. If I'm sitting there trying desperately to work to a deadline, I've been up, I've done 20-hour days for a week leading up to a show. There was one art show that I did in Ottawa maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and I didn't actually sleep before I got to the show. I was up from 5 a.m. Friday until 10 p.m. Saturday night. The show setup was at 9 a.m. on Saturday morning, and I worked all through the night, Friday night, Saturday morning, packed up the car, went to the show, set up, did the show on Saturday, crashed Saturday night, did it again on Sunday, and then packed up and came home. And that's not healthy. I was able to get enough product to bring to the show, but that wasn't healthy, and I had huge problems when I was at the show. It was tough to concentrate, and those are the things that I'm trying to avoid. And I find if I can leave the problem for a few days, I can often come back to it with better ideas on how to solve those problems and how to resolve the issues than if I keep hammering away on it.
And there are measurable physiological reasons for that as well. I can't remember the precise brainwave states where those creative connections start to be made. But that's why people often come up with breakthroughs while having a shower or going for a walk and that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Your mind is in a more relaxed state, and then there's just a certain neurochemical cocktail and set of brain waves that are really conducive to your brain just figuring out a problem in the background there, and then just suddenly springing it forward to your conscious.
Yeah, I find going to sleep, getting a good night's sleep, that has a huge impact on it. As you said, jumping in the shower, going for a walk. When I was in school, I did a lot of swimming, and fortunately, my pool was across the parking lot from my school. Swam at the university as well, and I would often write essays, compose essays while I was swimming. I'd be in the pool for 2 hours, and I would compose the essay while I was in the pool. You can't do anything else. You can't talk to people. It's the most antisocial sport you can do. And so I would have 2 hours to myself, and all I was doing was looking at a black line and counting laps. So I had nothing. My brain had nothing to do. I would often find that was a good time to work on essays, work on problems, and do that. I don't do enough of that these days, and I probably should. But certainly, getting into a different mindset, it's tough to do, but it's important. You need some sort of meditative thing that you can do that isn't the problem you're working on, I think. And that's a little bit different for everybody, but I think that's an important thing to find.
Yeah, there's value in zooming out from the nitty gritty details that you get lost in when you're actually in the problem, and taking a grander perspective on things, being able to make connections that you just simply couldn't when you're in the mix.
The other thing I found this year has been very positive is finding colleagues I can speak to about some of the problems. Whether it's somebody like Phil Poirier, who I was down visiting in November. We spoke about helping me with some of my deep drawing problems. Speaking with guys like Jim Binion when I've had some casting problems, or Chris Plouffe. He's also been excellent for working through some of my problems. Sometimes it's not even asking them specific questions of saying, oh, this is the problem that I'm having. How do I fix this? That's often not what ends up happening, or not the most useful thing. But just talking about what's going on, what you're doing, what they're doing. It's amazing how often somebody who is working in a related field will say something and the light bulb will just go off, and you'll be like, oh, that's what's going on here. And I think one of the most important things you can do, no matter which field you're in, whether it's an artistic field, whether it's a technical field, try and surround yourself with a community of peers who can assist you. And that assistance often just comes from talking. I'm fortunate, my good friend Rich Lowen, who's here in town, he and I sit down regularly and we just talk about whatever it is that's on our mind and whatever is, sort of going on in our shops. And oftentimes Rich will say something that will trigger, something in the back of my brain to say, oh, I need to try that, or I need to do this thing when I'm on there. And so it's, having people like that in your life to sort of talk through problems and just talk about what it is that you're doing. It's amazing how often other people can sort of trigger ideas in your mind. And in some cases, they don't even need to be in your field. They can just have interesting questions about what it is that you're doing, and asking you a question that forces you to think through what it is that you're doing and explain it to them in a way that they understand. That can often lead you to a better understanding of what it is that you're doing. And sometimes that's all you need to sort of get past a block in what it is that you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just sort of reframing things and getting a different perspective on the situation.
Now, how about you with your development, with iOS development? You're sort of working to Apple's schedule every year to some degree, because WWDC every year in, I guess, June, you're seeing a new beta release of their operating system. And then pretty much on a schedule every September, you're going to see a new phone, which in some cases like this year means some kind of a change, sometimes a bit easier, sometimes it's a bit more dramatic. So how do you find that? Do you find that motivating? Do you go through the new features and the new the new options that are available on phones and say I'm definitely going to try and get that out for day one, or how do you approach that?
Yeah, so there are aspects of that. I find actually most of the time I wind up playing catch up. So I have a few branches of experimental stuff that I'm working on that I want to pipe in to the main projects. But then Apple will release something new, and then all of a sudden I need to support a new screen size here, or a new dimension there, or various changes at a more subsystem level, just making adaptations there. So I found playing a lot of more catch up than I would like to have over the last, let's say, 4 years or so. That's taken a lot of time away from actually focusing on the things that I want to be focusing on developing. So I have quite a few things that I'm itching to tie up some loose ends on and actually get out there. So I would say that's my hope for this year, is to tie up a lot of small projects and loose ends and just put a bow on things so that I can narrow in the scope of what I've been up to.
Now, have you found that they've released new feature sets in new libraries, new APIs in the new operating systems that have made it or will make it easier for you to release some of these features? Like, have they made it easier in some cases for you to do things?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Particularly on, like, earlier on, it would be on the audio side of things. So there's a lot of audio processing work that I could offload onto core system functionality. And then this past year, the big thing was all the machine learning and vision and that sort of stuff that I had been rolling a lot of my own of in the year and a half or so leading up to WWDC 2017. So it's been both a nice release of not having to invest as much effort in laying the groundwork and the foundation, but there's also been a learning curve in terms of picking up where they have now raised the bar to. So it's, yeah, a mixed bag, but it's absolutely, they do release things that make it a lot easier to build towards what your end goal actually is. So I do appreciate that. I really like when I'm able to just delete a big block of code out of my own code base, because I mean, less code, less bugs. So I really appreciate that.
I was going to say that's very satisfying, deleting a bunch of stuff out of a code.
Yeah, and I get that same satisfaction from simplifying a problem down too. It's nice to be able to do that.
Now, how about when it comes to saying no to things? I don't know how much of your work is self-directed versus sort of mandatory, but do you, when it comes to your own personal projects, are you working on purely things that are sort of directed by you, or are you being approached by people for some things and you have to decide whether it's something that you want to do or not?
I am approached by people, and by and large, my answer is often no. When you say yes to something, you are, by extension, saying no to a bunch of other things. Because we all only have so much time. The reality is we all have limited time, limited money, and we can't say yes to everything. But this is an area where I would like to grow and get better at knowing what to say no to, because it's a very tricky balance to know what things are worth pursuing and what aren't. But I guess some of the things I think about when I'm considering working on a particular project or pursuing a particular experiment would be whether or not it's going to push me to grow or to learn something new. I try and look at the benefit to detriment ratio and try and make that as high as possible. Not only for me personally, but also looking at it from the perspective of family and friends and others. If I work on project X, will it have benefits beyond just myself.
Right.
I guess another way to frame that would be, what is this going to cost me? Not speaking strictly financially, but also in terms of time and opportunity and relationship costs. But some benefits can be hard to measure. I attended a talk a few days ago by Kevin Toms, and he was a key player in bringing the Philips Hue lighting system to market. And in his talk, he expressed the corporate obstacles that he faced in convincing Philips to open source the API for Hue. But he expressed how difficult it was to relay to executives the value in opening it up, because to them,
Sure.
this is Philips proprietary information, and it's hard for them to see, and for him to show the upside of opening it up. He essentially just ended up showing them that people were reverse engineering it just based on the API that they had out there, and figuring out the different ways that they could control their Hue light bulbs. So for anyone who doesn't know, a Hue lighting system are these smart light bulbs that you can program to be different colors or different intensities, and you can have them all networked and respond to essentially anything you can imagine. But it was effectively impossible for them to predict the upside of open sourcing it. But eventually he won out, and in retrospect, the free publicity that was engendered from all of the creative ways that people have built on the Hue platform, as far as the marketing team was concerned and the executives, that move was priceless. They couldn't begin to even quantify
Well, sure,
the
you
impact to the bottom line.
sure you end up creating a great deal of publicity for yourself, and you also, more importantly, you create a community around your product, and that's something that it's priceless, right? It's difficult to build that community, and if you can, then it becomes a very sticky product in people's minds, and it's something that people want to buy. I've got a bunch of Hue products around here, and I enjoy using them. There's some limitations of them that I'm not as happy with versus some other products, but they're very, very easy product to use, and it's nice to be able to set triggers and things with them. So that open source community that allows you to access them in different ways. That's certainly worth one of the reasons why I looked at them and avoided other products, because I knew that there was a community out there that was using them that could develop the tools that I wanted to make, because Philips themselves, they were only ever going to develop a limited product. They don't have the resources that hundreds or thousands of developers working in their spare time would have. So yeah, it's nice having that community.
Yeah, another thing that I find helpful is just categorizing things and writing stuff down just to get it out of my head, because I find a problem or a possibility can gnaw away at brain cycles and just chew them up needlessly. But once I write it down, it's kind of like my brain's like, okay, it's there, it's captured. We don't have to spend any more time thinking about that. And I'll just kind of go like, yes, this is something I want to pursue, or no, this isn't something I want to pursue. Forget about it. Or let's just shelve this, and it's something I can pick up again later.
I agree with that. I have notebooks full of ideas, some of them sketches, some of them one-word descriptions of something. Some of them are screen captures or images from places, photographs. So we've talked before about the fact I take thousands of photographs when I travel. And I find that getting those ideas out of my head and into something, whether it's an application on my phone, whether it's a notebook, whatever it happens to be, that's so important for me. And it's also important I find, to go back and revisit those notebooks. I've been keeping notebooks. I guess I've got them going back probably 13 or 14 years at this point. We had a house fire back in the early noughties and lost a lot of that stuff. But so I've got notebooks going back to about that time. So I guess about 14 years now. And I revisit those notebooks on a regular basis. Sometimes it's once a month. Sometimes it's every 6 months that I'll go back and look at certain notebooks, but I do go back and look at them, and sometimes they give me ideas for a current project that I'm working on. I need let's say a better proportions for a thing that I'm working on, maybe a picture frame or something like that. And I go back and I look at other projects that I was thinking about or that I'd sketched up, and sometimes those projects that I'm looking at are entirely unrelated to what it is that I'm making now. But there's often little ideas in there that I can pick. Sometimes it's a little detail element that I want. Sometimes it's that proportion that I'm looking for, and I couldn't get it figured out right. So I find that having a record of what it is that you're thinking about is critical. That's one of the reasons why I recommended a good pencil and notebook in our episode a few episodes ago. Keeping that record of what it is that you're working on, struggles that you're having, ideas that you're having. Part of it is to get it out of your head so that, as you say, it's not taking up brain cycles trying to remember it. But I think one of the most valuable parts of doing that is being able to go back to that record days, weeks, years later and reusing those ideas. I know certainly some of my early pen ideas, when I look at them now, they're incredibly immature in terms of, even though they were well sketched and they were completely, let's say a completely designed pen, so many of the elements are so immature compared to what I design now. But the base idea is still there, and I can now take that idea and I can turn it into something far more interesting. Sometimes there was too much in a design, and I now understand better how to distill it into something more interesting. But having that original design sketch is important to be able to come back to and pull the essence out of.
Yeah, just as it's nice to delete code, I find every now and then it's nice to go back and delete something from a note file, or just throw out an old book or piece of paper that I've had sort of kicking around with some things written on it that, looking back with hindsight, I find laughable. Well, kind of question what I was thinking.
Oh, there's certainly some horrible ideas in some of my early notebooks. Don't get me wrong, but I won't delete any of those ideas. I don't throw out any of my old sketches, as horrible as some of them are. I don't do that. It's funny. I get people asking me what can they learn or what can they do to become a better artist or to get into making things. And one of the things I tell people is to learn how to sketch. I can't sketch to save my life, and I really wish that I could draw better. Learn how to draw, learn how to start sketching and start doodling and do a lot of that. A good friend of ours, Stephen Strang, he has this incredible ability to sketch while he's in meetings, while he's talking to people, and I'm always envious of his sketching ability as he's working and as he's talking to people. And he's not sketching things that are related to the topic necessarily or the meeting, but that ability to get his ideas out visually is always something that's impressed me. And if you can learn how to do that, it's certainly worthwhile. When it comes to what to say yes to, I think your comment earlier about improving yourself in development is extremely important. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm trying to avoid anything with a hard deadline. And the notable exception to that has been the paper that I agreed to write for this year's Santa Fe Symposium. And it's been causing me a great deal of stress over the last 2 months because I knew that I was going to be a little bit late on it. And I've been working trying to get through some problems and get the writing finished. And so I knew that it was going to be stressful, and it wasn't stress that I really wanted in my life. But something like that, it's extremely important because it's forcing me to develop some skills and some ideas that I would otherwise ignore if I didn't have this. So this is one of the few times where I've said, okay, I need this, in this case, it has a deadline. So I need this project to actually get me working on this particular project. So last year's paper was about how to make Niello, traditional methods of making Niello. And for those who haven't read my paper yet, you can go and find it at the Santa Fe website. We'll link to it. But Niello is a silver alloy that has lead in it. And the lead, of course, is a huge safety hazard and health hazard for the people working with it. This year, I'm working on creating a lead-free version of Niello. Niello is a material that I use a lot in my designs, and the lead is obviously very toxic, and it's very dangerous, and it has other consequences in the shop. It contaminates things in the shop. And I've been putting off working on making a version of this that wasn't as toxic. And so this was one of those things where I said, okay, if I do this paper on making a lead-free Niello, that's something that's going to force me to move forward with this, and it's something that's going to, it's providing me with a reason to do this. So sometimes those kinds of projects are worthwhile, and can certainly be important, and they can be sort of a good kick in the ass to figure out how to do something that you weren't necessarily going to do otherwise. Don't shy away from projects that are good personal development, even if there's limited monetary value in it. As long as the stress is reasonable and you're not taking on too much, it's worthwhile. But also don't fool yourself into taking a project because you think it's going to teach you something. If it's just a minor addition to your skill set that you're going to learn, but it's going to increase your stress levels a lot, then say no to it. It's not worth it. It has to be something that's really worthwhile, increasing your skill set and improving your understanding of something to take it on. Sometimes for me, it's an external factor. Something like this symposium is a good way of forcing me to do it. In other cases, we've talked about my working on watches, and that's something that I've had an interest in for a long time, and so I've created a few projects that I'm working on, and that's one of my other big goals for 2018 is to start seriously working on my watch projects and get those at least something that I'm happy with by the end of the year. A large part of the reason why I'm doing that is to develop those skills, to develop that knowledge and understanding, because I know the only way that I'm going to do it or I'm going to learn those things is to have a project that's out there. And that's probably something else worthwhile talking about. I find that learning skills, I'm not sure about you, John, but I find that learning skills is very difficult in a vacuum. If you're just learning a skill academically, I find it very challenging. But having a project to work on is important, or at least I find that it's important to learning a skill. It gives you, if you know what you're trying to do. So, for instance, in my case, I'm working on recording some video. I knew very little about video going into this. I knew a lot about photography, very, very little about audio. And if, I'd played around with lynda.com videos on Final Cut Pro editing and things like that, but I never really got all that far with them. And it wasn't until I had some actual video footage of a project that I made in the shop that I could then cut together and work on creating a story for. Same thing with this podcast. I'd done a little bit of audio editing here and there, but mostly it was sort of playing around with random audio stuff. Once I had some recordings for the show, it made it much easier for me to learn how to use Logic and how to edit things together properly and how to do some noise cleanup and things like that. And it wasn't until I had that project to work on where I had a final goal that I had and I knew what I wanted it to sound like that I really started to learn how to do things. So certainly if you're looking to learn a new skill, try to find a worthwhile project that you can work on that builds on that skill, something that'll push you a little bit. Don't try and do just the easiest thing you can, because that probably won't get very much out of it. But if you have an end goal, then it's worthwhile. There's a really good quote from Ira Glass. He's the producer of This American Life, and he's talking about the difference between your skill now versus your imagined thing that you want to make. and how they don't match up yet. You're not good enough at the beginning to be able to make the thing that you want to make in your mind's eye. But it's important that you have that thing in your mind's eye to start with. And as you keep working on it, you'll keep getting better and better. And eventually you will be able to get to that end goal. It's certainly important to have that. Try not to learn just in a vacuum, because it's difficult to do.
Yeah, actually pursuing a project very quickly reveals all the areas where you were expressing a bit of hubris, and other areas where you were just blindly ignorant of the problems you'd come up against.
And you can't get around the challenges by just saying, "Oh well, I don't want to have that thing in here anymore." Well, if you're just working on an academic project, you can easily cut out a bit of something and say, "Well, I don't really want that." But if you're working on, I'm working on this watch case, and I'm sitting there trying to figure out, okay, how do I mount that movement in the watch case? Well, I can't just ignore that problem. This isn't just an academic problem where I'm playing around with a watch movement. I have to actually figure out how to get it into a case and have it stable in the case so that it's not going to rattle around, and it's going to look good and everything. And those are problems that you can easily talk yourself out of if you're just sort of doing it for an academic kind of project. If it's a real world project like that, you have to figure out how to get around that problem and how to solve it.
Or that's the sort of thing that you're just not even aware is a problem at all if you're just daydreaming about doing a certain thing.
Oh, sure. The number of unknown unknowns in a project like that is incredible when you get started. I guess this goes back to the whole Dunning-Kruger effect, where when you're getting started on something, when you're a complete novice at something, you really don't understand just how little you know about the thing. And it isn't until you start getting into actually making it that you realize, oh, I've got to deal with this problem now, and how do I deal with making sure that the crown is waterproof, and how do I make sure that I've got a secure way of holding the strap in place, and oh, now I need to come up with a buckle for this watch that matches the design and the feel of the rest of the watch, and how do I make a dial that looks good, and oh, I need to make hands now and design those hands. And it's amazing how quickly you start figuring out the things that you just didn't know at all until you started this project.
Yeah, the more makers and watchmakers and developers that I speak to, the more I realize that the learning never stops. There's always something more. Once you hit the top of one mountain, you realize there's another one behind it, and then you scale that peak, and there's yet another one. So it's the learning never stops. So what are some of the filters that you look at a potential project through to make the call as to whether to pursue it or not?
I guess right now I have a few goals that I have in mind. Obviously, I'm continuing to work on some pen designs. That's an important thing for me. And the next big goal for me professionally, in terms of my design and my work, is working on some watches and getting some watches designed. I think that's long term. That's a challenge that I want personally, both the technical challenge and the design challenges. So for me, watches are something I've always been fascinated with, and I think I need to scratch that itch. I need to scratch that itch of having the technical understanding of watches. But more importantly, I think that watches present a design challenge that I don't get right now with pens. Pens are relatively simple from a design point of view, and also from a technical point of view. So watches are going to be one of my big goals and focuses over the next little while. And I think partially as well, experimenting a bit with clocks, mostly because clocks are a bit simpler than watches. Obviously, the scale is larger, which makes them simpler to make. You're not dealing with when you're cutting gear teeth, for instance, you're not talking about tiny, tiny little teeth. So you can experiment a little bit with clocks in a way that you can't necessarily do quickly with watches. So there's a few ideas that I have, to help me with my understanding of timekeeping and just the technical aspects of that. And then there's also a few ideas that I have for art pieces, some desk clocks and things like that, where I want to experiment with some of the classic techniques that I know, particularly when it comes to some of the techniques that and design ideas that Fabergé was doing. I want to try and translate some of their designs, which I think right now don't necessarily look good. I think they're just a bit too ornate, but try and translate those into something a little bit more modern, something that looks good. So being able to take something like a picture frame and do some engine turning work on it, do some enamel work on it, maybe turn that into something that's a little bit more interesting, like a little desk clock, combine some of my curiosity for clocks and watches and turn that and then mix that with some of my jewelry skills. So a lot of it has to do with a particular topic, like watches, and saying, okay, this is where I want to go. I want to explore that a bit and see where it takes me. Some of it is taking a particular technique and saying, okay, I want to use more engine turning in the work that I do. What can I do with this? Where can I use it to its best effect? And then in some cases, it's saying, oh, I really like that particular piece. I like that, maybe it's a historic piece. Maybe it's a modern piece that another designer has made, and say, oh, I really like that idea. How can I incorporate that into something that I want to make? There have been a few techniques that I've seen recently from artists that I admire, and I would never want to try and copy that work in the medium that they're doing, or even to try and copy it directly. But I think there are ways of taking those techniques, some of them that are quite unique to those individual artists, and turning them into something that works well with what I do. And that's always an interesting challenge to me, is how do I find something that I like? How do I find a technique I like or a design I like and translate it into something that works with what it is that I'm doing?
And drawing inspiration from it.
For those of you who've never watched Everything is a Remix, Kirby Ferguson did this great little series of videos a few years ago called Everything is a Remix.
Mm-hmm.
And he was approaching it originally from a lot of popular media.
I think it started just with music, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And I think he does a great job of framing this idea of taking how an artist can take an idea from somebody else and turn it into their own thing.
Mm-hmm.
He starts out with a particular segment of music. I can't even remember where it originally came from. And he shows how that particular beat is used in multiple genres of music over decades. And he also talks a little bit about movie making. People like George Lucas and Quentin Tarantino, where they're pulling a lot of their ideas from other artists and how they make it their own. For those, for people who don't necessarily understand what's involved with, how an artist can take something and make it their own, or take an idea from somebody else and translate it into their own thing. He has some great examples of how that's done in popular culture.
It's fascinating to listen to it mutate over the decades, right through to like a Miley Cyrus song where she wasn't even born when the original song first debuted.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I wish you all the best for 2018, Chris.
Thank you. Same to you. We'll see what maybe at the end of 2018 we'll sit there and revisit this and see how little we were able to get done this year.
I think it was Bill Gates who said most people overestimate what they can do in a year, but vastly underestimate what they can get done in 10.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. Jon can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.
Pick up any new tools over the break?
What did I pick up? I did pick up some new tools. I picked up a few new toys for doing some video recording. I picked up an external video recorder I don't know how familiar you are with recording video on cameras, especially digital SLRs, but a lot of them are recording into compressed formats like AVCHD and occasionally MP4 or things like that. And they're doing that because, of course, they're trying to save space on the memory cards, and they're also trying to cut down on the amount of bandwidth that they need when it comes to recording. So you can use slower memory cards. Problem is that there's a bunch of limitations with that. It's a compressed format, obviously, so you're dealing with compression issues. So you can't just take an MP4, for instance, and just start cutting it and re-edit it. And so you have to then transcode it into a format that's editable. And in my case, I'm using Final Cut Pro, so I'm going into ProRes 422. There's a lot of problems with recording straight to video onto a digital SLR. So there's a market for these external recorders, and these are used in the professional world as well, not just digital SLR stuff or prosumer stuff. It's a problem in the real world as well. And what they do is that you bypass the video out to the HDMI port on the camera, and it goes into this video recorder. And so it's just sending all of the raw pixel data off of the sensor into the HDMI port, comes off onto this video recorder, and it can handle doing ProRes 422 native recording. So it can handle much higher bit rates than the internal cards can. It's recording straight to an SSD, things like that. So at the end of it, what I get is this ProRes file that I can drop into Final Cut Pro. I don't have to transcode it. I can just start editing it instantly and start working on it right away. I want to do some video shooting and get some videos up. And one of the things that I was struggling with in my experiments was I would record a bunch of video, and right now I'm just recording in 1080p, but I would record a bunch of video and I would take 10 minutes of video and it would sit there for an hour transcoding it into ProRes. And it's like, I can't do this. It takes forever. And then of course you've got all the loss problems because it was coming from a lossy format. So this is saving me a bunch of time in transcoding, and it's saving me a bunch of quality as well. And then there's other advantages to this little recorder. It's also a 7-inch screen, so you get a bigger version of what you're seeing on camera. So it's easier to do things like focus, easier for exposure adjustments and all that, all that good stuff. So anyway, a bunch of advantages to that. So that was my big purchase for Christmas, was getting myself one of these so I could start getting more serious about video recording.
Not to add another item to your list, but I had a chance to play with one of DJI Mavic Pros. DJI's Mavic Pros.
Yeah, they don't make their any of their product names are not easy to pronounce.
Yeah. Anyway, the Mavic Pros, I was very impressed with it.
I have the Osmo Mobile. Their gimbal technology is great. I haven't played with the Mavic Pro yet, but I know a bunch of people that have them, and everybody's happy with those things.
I was blown away by its ability to do the action tracking. So you can almost set it and forget it and just walk around and have it follow you, or run around, bike around, what have you. So I thought you would have some fun with that out around your place there. I
know I would have some fun with it. I know I would crash it into my trees at some point. I would love to play with one of those things, but it's low down on my list of toys to get, just because I don't need another thing going around.
It's better for you to wait anyway, because apparently they're going to be rolling out collision avoidance in a full 360 as opposed to just from the front.
Right.
Not too distant future.
Yeah, I noticed that CES is going on right now, and they just announced the update to the Osmo Mobile, which I got maybe 4 or 5 months ago, and they've just released they've just announced the second version of that, and they've improved a bunch of things like battery life and stuff like that. So I'm sure that the next couple generations of Mavic Pros are going to be nice. I figure that in a couple of years, once they've sort of banged out most of that technology, I'll pick something up. Then the next thing for me is going to be getting a new camera that can handle doing 4K footage, because right now my Nikon D810 can only handle doing 1080p. Even though the stuff that I'm doing is destined for YouTube, YouTube is sort of pushing towards 4K footage. And so I figure at this point, if I start in on 4K from the very beginning, then I don't have to worry about transitioning to it down the road. It's already all sort of taken care of.
Have you recorded any 4K using your phone in the Osmo?
I have, yeah, a little bit. I haven't played around with it a whole lot. So I did do some 4K shooting on my 7 when I was in Japan last year, and did a little bit of recording with that. And I was actually kicking myself because that was the third trip I had been on where I wish that I had had the Osmo Mobile and didn't have it. And I'd considered getting one before I went over, and I didn't have the time to go and pick one up. And I was sort of kicking myself. Now that I've got it, I just haven't been out of the house much to sort of play with it. But that's on it's on my list of things to experiment with more, because it's even though it's a bit bulky, like it's not the kind of thing you can just sort of throw in your back pocket and go. It's still relatively small, and of course the phone is with you all the time anyway. So I'm going to play around with it a little bit. I know when I go down on my trip to Albuquerque for the symposium, I'll definitely be bringing it with me then, and hopefully play around with it a little bit there and try and get some video footage.
And one thing that I found really surprising about the Mavic Pro as well is just how well it stood up to the brutal cold that we had here over the Christmas break.
Oh, really?
It was just bitterly cold out, and like the footage that was coming off it was still just buttery smooth. Despite you look up at the drone in the sky, and it's just jittering and shaking there in the wind. The image is just as close to rock solid as you can get.
Yeah, that's the thing that really makes them stand apart from everybody else, is just the quality of their gimbals, and their image stability stuff is just amazing. So yeah, it impresses me with that, and even just a little bit that I've sort of played around with the Osmo Mobile. It's between the gimbal and the image stabilization in the camera, you get some really nice footage. It's definitely impressive.
Have you ever played with Instagram's hyperlapse app?
No, I haven't.
It's quite impressive as well. If you throw it's meant for doing hyperlapses, so time lapses very quickly and very smoothly. But you can set it to 1x mode, and it's essentially like having a steady cam on your phone. Now, it downsamples to, I think the highest it'll output is 720p in order to pull this off. But it's very impressive for a very low budget, well, effectively free if you've already got the phone. It's a free app, a free Steadicam.
My only complaint about Instagram stuff is just how heavily compressed everything is.
Yeah, this isn't going to be 4K YouTube worthy footage that you're recording, but no. It's really nice in terms of just how smooth it is. I used it for a DVD project, so it's actually an old school Laserdisc was the final output.
Oh, right. Yeah, I think you told me about that.
It worked out well. So 720p to the job.
Yeah, I'm going to see how the footage from the phone looks when I match it up with the footage from my camera. Obviously, my Nikon D810, I've got the advantage of having a much larger sensor. It's a full frame 35 millimeter sensor. Plus, I've got the advantage of dramatically better lenses. I've got pro lenses for my camera. So between the two, I can definitely get a much nicer look out of my D810 than I can out of my phone. But I think the phone footage is pretty good at this point, and it does hold up pretty well to a lot of the digital SLR footage. So I'm thinking about adding a little bit of phone footage into some of the stuff that I'm doing. In particular, I'm thinking about using the Osmo Mobile for doing some tracking shots, because you can do things like select an object on screen and move side to side and have the camera follow and keep that object in frame. So stuff like that, I can do some interesting tracking shots with the Osmo that I just can't do easily with my digital SLR. Anyway, I'm going to play around with that a little bit and see what I can get.
Yeah, I think the real trick there is just getting your white balance matched and just color grading the footage so that it looks similar in post.
Yeah, the color grading is the biggest problem, and that I've got One of the other little things that I picked up was the color passport checker. It's a calibrated color chart that you can put on screen, and then inside of Final Cut Pro, there's a little plugin that you can use to automatically color balance against that color chart. And then from there, you can color grade it however you want. But at least you've started with something that's balanced. That makes life a lot easier. It saves a huge amount of time and guesswork just trying to get that initial white balance and color grading done.